evening, everyone, and welcome to this first event in the Green Institute's new program, The Missing Piece, talking about nonviolence. For those who don't know me, my name's Tim Hollow. I'm Executive Director of the Green Institute, and I couldn't be more thrilled that so many of you have joined us tonight and that we can launch this program that's been in my head for quite some years and in planning for several months with two true legends of the Greens Party, the environment movement, and the peace movement, former Senators Joe Vallentine and Bob Brown. Every now and then, I genuinely have to pinch myself at the conversations I get to present with the Green Institute, and this is absolutely one of those moments. I'm so grateful to you, Bob and Joe, for agreeing to take part in this discussion about the Greens' commitment to peace.
Thank you.
Before we go any further, I want to start by acknowledging that we're having this discussion and launching this series of conversations on stolen land, on land that always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'm on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and those still to come. I acknowledge on behalf of all of us, both the extreme violence that colonisation has visited upon them and the extraordinary example to us of the fact that First Nations people lived on this continent for countless millennia with no wars of aggression, no wars over land. Indeed, I'm told that in all Aboriginal languages, there is literally no word for invade or conquer. In a worldview where land is law, where country owns us, the concept of such war is quite literally unthinkable. We have so much to learn if only we would listen. And I'm hugely looking forward to bringing you a conversation about decolonisation, non-violence and First Nations philosophies as the fourth session in this program that we will hopefully announce in the next few days. Also, before we go any further, I think we're all pretty used to Zoom conversations by now, but as always, please make sure you keep yourself on mute. Feel free to have your camera on or off, but as I said, with bandwidth, we may ask you to turn them off. And pop your thoughts, comments, and questions to the speakers in the chat as we go. Joe and Bob will speak to us, we'll have a discussion, and then we'll make sure to leave a good chunk of time for Q&A before we finish. Now, the missing piece, as I mentioned, is an idea that's been gestating for some years. And I think the fact that we've had so much interest in this conversation shows why. We all know we're living in an increasingly unstable and volatile world. Facing the climate and ecological crisis, the rise of the extreme right with its politics of hate and exclusion, spiralling economic inequality, rampant misinformation, not to mention, of course, horrific violence, from the murder of women by intimate partners, to the massacre of animals, to active war over territory in Ukraine, and ethnic cleansing and genocides in Sudan, Nagorno-Karabakh, Myanmar, and Palestine. We know these are all interrelated, intertwined, feeding on each other. We know as the world gets more unstable, more divided, violence feeds more violence. And Israel-Palestine, as I have to observe as a lefty Jew who's been copping it from both sides for daring to talk about peacemaking, is a textbook example of violence feeding violence, trauma feeding violence, trauma feeding more violence. And the refusal to imagine an alternative to violence, the refusal to consider coming together across difference, which pervades our politics. It feels like the commitment to non-violence as a strategy, a tactic, and a philosophy is weaker than it's been for generations, right when we need it most. And as the great Judith Butler writes, non-violence is perhaps best described as a practice of resistance that becomes possible, if not mandatory, precisely at the moment when doing violence seems most justified and obvious. But it's hard for us to think about that because the language of peace is so missing from our politics. The practices of non-violence and peace, from the interpersonal to the global, are less and less part of how we act. And governments, of course, are very cleverly accusing non-violent protesters of being violent, deliberately confusing the issue as a way of delegitimizing protest. And because the language of peace is missing, we're not able to fight back with a coherent argument and clear critique. It's crucial that we reclaim the the language of peace. We have to talk about nonviolence. We have to read about it, discuss it, work to define and articulate it as an active force for change from the bottom up, not the naive, weak, or privileged position it's too often caricatured as. If we dig into it, the philosophy and practice of nonviolence, we'll find brilliant strategies that will not only help us to achieve our goals, but teach us crucial lessons in how to make decisions to get the better, how to disagree better, how to do democracy better, and crucially, how to cultivate the entangled world we want to live in together. Nonviolence is the path to transformation, to system change, living into being the world we need. If we understand change as emergent, that what comes next grows from what we do, we recognize that only through nonviolence can we create a world of peace. It's this transformative ecofeminist understanding of nonviolence which saw the principle embraced by environmentalists and Greens from the earliest days of the movement. And that's what we're talking about tonight as we launch The Missing Piece. With two of the founding parents of the party, we'll be delving into the Greens' commitment to peace, why it was so important in the early days of the Greens that peace and nonviolence became one of the party's four pillars, the connection between nonviolent direct action and Greens politics, our commitment to global peace, and how it's faring. So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. I don't think either of our speakers need a lot of introduction to you, but I'll give a short introduction anyway. First, we're going to hear from Jo Vallentine, who was elected to the Senate for WA for the Nuclear Disarmament Party in 1984 and re-elected for the Greens in 1990, serving as the first Greens federal MP and continuing, of course, as an active member and supporter to this day. A lifelong peace activist, Jo has been arrested at Pine Gap, was involved, of course, in the Jabiluka blockade and helped found the Alternatives to Violence project. It is such a privilege to have you with us tonight, Jo. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Well, thanks, Tim. Wonderful introduction. I think you've actually said so much that needs to be said right now. I want to begin by acknowledging the Whadjuk Noongar people of this land, where I'm sitting in Perth. And I want to take you back to 1962, which sounds like a long way back, but the beginning of international awareness and the need for peace came for me during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which some of us oldies remember, terrifying as it was at the time. I was in my final year at school, and I distinctly remember the nun at Loreto Convent, where I was a boarder, pinning up on the notice board what she called the leading article, which was the editorial from the newspaper. And she said, girls, you need to be aware of this. She didn't tell us what it was about, so we all went over and read it, and it was terrifying. And we've just commemorated Hiroshima Day yesterday, Nagasaki Day coming up in a couple of days. All of these issues, of course, as Tim has already said, are interconnected. But that made me start to think about weapons and how terribly damaging they could be. So sometime later, I went on a scholarship to the United States, and I was there when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. It was another big shock. We were to have been addressed, all these foreign students who'd gathered from many, many countries around the world in the United States for a fabulous year at an American high school, I have to say. Having come from a convent boarding school, it was quite an eye-opener in many ways. However, we were to have been addressed by the president at the end of our year, and he was bopped off. So his brother came to talk to us, Robert F. Kennedy, subsequently assassinated. But I actually shook Robert Kennedy's hand at that meeting, and it was extraordinary because he said to us something which I have never forgotten and which still makes me choke up, because he said, here you are, students from so many countries with different backgrounds, different cultures, and you've had a good year in the United States. And we all shouted out, yes, of course. And he said, in the future, some of you will be leaders of your countries. And can you imagine pitting any of your countries against any other countries represented here in a war. And of course, we all shouted out no, just about lifting the roof off. But those were quite, that was a really big influence for me. Hearing that somebody who sadly was assassinated not long afterwards and who had helped avert the Cuban Missile Crisis, I think he did more about that than his brother. However, it was a big year. And then I came across Quakers because I went to this convent boarding school where we got a dose of social justice, yes, but I found it wanting when I was traveling. I did a lot of traveling and I saw pollution and poverty and overpopulation in some parts of the world. And a friend of mine said, well, you might like this mob, this Quaker mob. They're not doing dress ups and they're not, fanning around with candles and incense and all that stuff, but they sit quietly in a circle. Oh, I said, okay, we'll give that a go. And that was in 1972. Quakers have been an extraordinary influence for me because they've been committed to nonviolence since their formation in the 1660s, when they told the king and they told Cromwell at the time of the wars then that they would take up arms for nobody, for neither side. So a couple of families in particular, Gares and Wilkinsons, these oldies who are probably younger than I am now, but they seemed quite elderly to me at the time, they were extraordinary because they lived the principles of nonviolence so clearly. And we used to stand on the street corner where I was last night, actually, for the Hiroshima commemoration. It's a very familiar corner to me after all these years of standing there so many times. And they had a big banner which said disarmament, East and West. Of course, there were so many who said then, oh, you're just a mob of communists and, you're really on the side of the Soviets and all of that kind of rubbish. Well, you have to take all of that. Remember Gandhi's 4 stages. He said, first of all, you'll be ignored, and then you'll be ridiculed, and then you'll be tortured. And if you're still alive after all of that, you might have victory. Woohoo! So you got to hang in there. It's about persistence. It's about principle. We all have a moral compass. Unfortunately, many people in politics discard their moral compass once they get there. I think most people go into politics thinking they really want to make a difference for the good of the nation or the world. I really do believe that. But they seem to very often lose their moral compass altogether. But having grown up with that Catholic background where you examine your conscience every night before you go to sleep and think, well, what have I done today which has been good or useful? And what have I done today which has not been good or useful? Moral compass is pretty strong in my being. So it was wonderful to find a group of people who were so committed to nonviolence and who ran nonviolence training camps in the 70s. That was just fantastic. And then, of course, along came the opportunity for me, just completely out of the blue. I never intended to be in politics or a senator. I was often called the accidental senator, and I quite liked that because it was a bit of an accident. But the Nuclear Disarmament Party came into being in 1984 when Ronald Reagan was the president. And he said in one unguarded moment when he thought the microphones were off, well, let's nuke the Ruskies, he said, joke, joke. It was pretty scary stuff, but actually compared with what we've had, recently, and we might be having again, he seems like a paragon of virtue. However, it really led to that Nuclear Disarmament Party forming, and I happened to be the candidate for the West. And then I ran across Petra Kelly, and I know Bob will probably speak about her too, but a most extraordinary woman from Germany. And Die Grünen had formed in the late 70s, and their 4 pillars we pinched quite unashamedly, and they said, fine, that's good, you can have them. And so nonviolence and peacemaking was a very important part of the formation of the Greens. And sometimes I think I wish the Greens now paid more attention to that particular pillar. We're very good at enunciating and articulating and campaigning about all of the other pillars. I wish there was a bit more interest in nonviolence and peacemaking. And I've tried to do that in the time, you know, that since I left the Parliament in particular. But there have been so many opportunities through that time in the Senate to make my non-violence come to the fore. I used to talk about love in the Senate, and I think other people just roll their eyes and think, oh my God, here she goes again, you know, kind of thing. They wanted to dismiss me. So it was very important for me not to be dismissed and to be seen as a reasonable human being who could talk to anybody about pretty much anything. And so I was not going to be labeled as merely a troublemaker, although I was that too, but I wanted to be able to get into the conversations and find the common ground. There's always common ground. And I think that that's terribly important as we campaign in any area, to find the common ground, to listen to the people who we think might be our opponents. Listening is one of the most important aspects of nonviolence, I believe. Listening. That's probably enough from me right now. I think, Tim, let Bob have a go, hey?
Thank you so much, Joe. Wonderfully inspiring and informative. And I'm so glad you brought up Petra Kelly and her writing on peace and nonviolence. Among other things, I find tremendously inspiring. And we'll come back to you, but now it's my immense privilege also to introduce the wonderful Bob Brown, who needs no introduction, also as the founding leader of the Tasmanian Greens, entering state parliament in 1983, immediately after being released from prison, having been arrested at the Franklin blockade. Bob was elected to the Senate in 1996, served as the sole Green there until he built the party so strongly all around the country, served as leader of the Greens until 2012. Many people aren't aware that among Bob's first political stands was a hunger strike on top of Mount Wellington, protesting the nuclear-powered USS Enterprise docking in Hobart. Bob, thank you so much for making the time to be with us tonight. Over to you.
Thank you, Tim, and hello, everybody. And Joe, thank you. It's great to hear you just going to the first principles you've always had, thanks to the Green Institute. And it's great that we are talking about peace and nonviolence. You know, my political awareness came in the 1970s. We were still within 30 years of the Second World War. And after the Second World War, the whole world was galvanized by the need to promote peace and to never do that again. And so there were millions of people in organizations which were devoted to peace and nonviolence. One of the outcomes of that movement was the United Nations, but another outcome was the movement for one world, the feeling that we have got to get rid of borders, that we've got to be able to relate to each other and see each other as citizens first of the planet before we get into regional, religious, racial, whatever other differences that we've had in the past that have led to such terrible outcomes as World Wars I and II. It was huge, and it impacted on all of us. And as Joe mentioned, not least the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and indeed Dresden, and the whole tens of millions of people so needlessly slaughtered, that we had to find a better way as human beings to live on this planet, or we have no future. And that still pertains. And at that time, the recognition that we also had to stop violating nature was coming to the fore very rapidly. And here came the Greens. And Tim, you mentioned Petra Kelly. She was at the forefront of De Grünen, the Greens establishment in Germany, because of the pollution causing the death of the Black Forest and acidification of lakes. But she'd also experienced the impact of nuclear weaponry personally. She had a relative, very close relative, who came to grief over radiation, and she was very strongly against the nuclear reactor system because she knew it was going to lead to nuclear armaments. Indeed, we now have 8 to 12 countries with nuclear weaponry or the ability to make them very quickly in the world. Petra, by the way, anybody, if you want to after this, just look up, Google Petra Kelly quotes, and there it all is. She recognised that peace and non-violence was a condition of being able to live freely ourselves, not just a state of apparent social unrest for a given time. She realised also that we had to change the power structures. We had to change the whole setup. And of course, capitalism, the dominance of those people who own the money and the property is part of the problem. And the ability to share in everything was incredibly important so that everybody would have an opportunity to make the best of their life on this planet. In Australia, I can speak for Tasmania, the United Tasmania Group set up in probably the world's first public meeting of a Greens party. That was the 23rd of March, 1972, just before I came to Tasmania. And within a year, they had a new ethic. And part of that ethic was that we should not have aggression towards people or towards the environment, and that there should be peace at the centre of the decision-making of our society. Not long after that came the green bans, in particular in New South Wales, and the wonderful Jack Mundy, who took to, first of all, non-cooperation, which was striking, refusing to work, and then joining residents at the Rocks in Sydney, down there at Circular Quay, to prevent a colossal proposed glass tower replacement of the historic Rocks region. As we know, the Rocks are still there because they had a black ban on the works there. That became called a green ban because it was actually to protect the living environment. And then women from upriver at Lane Cove, Kelly's Bush, came and asked if the unions would help stop bulldozers going in to knock the bush down on Sydney Harbour. And that happened as well. And out of this came the term Greens bans. Petra Kelly made a beeline straight for Jack Mundy when she came to Australia, and she got him to go back to a global conference in Birmingham. And out of that came the word green, actually, for the collective, now more than 80 Greens parties around the world, out of the term green ban in Sydney, because it no longer just meant the environment, but it included social justice, peace, and democracy. And here we are, way down the line from that. And as Tim said in the introduction, maybe the least discussed or implemented or worked upon of those is peace. But if we don't have it, if we don't employ non-violence in decision-making, there is no future for life on this planet. We now have, besides atomic weapons and genetic weapons, biochemical weapons, artificial intelligence, out of control. And who's on that ladder? Who's in control of that? Elon Musk, and great friend and supporter of Donald Trump, and so on. And we are in a situation where if we allow ourselves to simply sit back and watch while that's happening, there is no future on this planet. I repeat that, if we allow ourselves to sit back and do nothing about it, there is no future for life on this planet. People like Stephen Hawking was warning about that before his untimely death a few years ago. So how do we proceed? Well, that process is through non-violent action. And I'll just give you the examples of the protests that are occurring increasingly around the world and in this country for social justice and for the environment. And I was in the police court in Tasmania here just 2 days ago and found guilty of standing in front of a tree, because that's illegal these days if somebody in authority wants to make money out of wood chipping that tree. And the swift parrots, which are going to extinction, and scientists tell us will be extinct by next decade if this destruction of their habitat isn't stopped, have no defence unless we human beings intervene against that sort of decision making, and will be sentenced. I and the 2 women who were locked onto machinery at that stage next Wednesday. We won't get jail sentences, but they are making an example of us, they think. And as I said outside the court, the only appeal to make here is to appeal to more Australians to come and join us in non-violence, because it is the thing which will show the authorities that the majority of Australians, and all the opinion polls show this, want an end to the destruction of forest and wildlife habitat. And the job is to mobilise those people, and they will do it if increasingly they see what's going on in our forests. So it's the Franklin campaign, which at its heart seemed completely lost. Both political parties in Tasmania, both houses of parliament, all the press, the unions, of course, the chambers of manufacturers, the big money, was in favour of the dam, and they won a stunning victory. All us anti-dammers, except for Norm Sanders, lost. And so it seemed completely impossible. But 18 months later, through the democratic system and through people seeing the protests going on the Franklin on their television at night, so many people changed their votes. It brought in a Labor government, which changed its policy because of the campaigning, and the river was saved. I don't see that necessarily as what's going to happen to our planet, but I do see that the only hope for our future of our planet, and what a brilliant thing this is, being alive on planet Earth in amongst billions of planets in the universe, the only one so far as we know that have life and love and laughter and the beauty of everything we enjoy. And we let that go. We can't do it. And you know, our motto is at our foundation, don't get depressed, get active. But being active means taking to non-violence. Like Gandhi, like so many people back in history who've employed non-violence, we are very strongly against taking violent means. I have people come to me and say, you got the wrong thing. You should be using gelignite. You should be blowing things up. You should put, some destructive tactics into play. They will win if we do that. They have the arms, they have the police, they have the army, and democracies work through governments being able to utilise the powers they have to put down people who are in insurrection. The one problem they can't do is put down the conscience of people who are working for a better future. They cannot jail our consciences. They can take us off, but they can't do that. Non-violence is the answer to making this planet livable, and that's something we all have to live for our children and their children, but for all our fellow species on this planet. It's a very powerful force. It worked with the Franklin. It can work for all of us. And I only look forward to the day when we get an Australian government which promotes peace and non-violence globally. A really non-aligned, independent, self-confident Australia intervening, offering what Joe was talking about, the process of bringing people together and making compacts for peace instead of the awfully destructive wars that Tim mentioned at the start of tonight's session. Non-violence is powerful. It's instructive. It creates change. And as far as I'm concerned, I love it. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you so much, Bob. Absolutely tremendous and inspiring. I really love how you present the vision for a world of peace that you bring into the conversation, the idea of a world beyond borders, and that we can imagine this next world is what nonviolence to me is fundamentally so much about, as well as, of course, the very practical, that if we use violence, we lose, which I think is something we tend to forget in the conversation.
Mhm.
Such wonderful presentations from both of you, bringing us the conception of nonviolence and why it's so deep in our philosophy as Greens. What I'd like to do now is ask you how you think that's gone in the intervening period of time for Greens, particularly as we have become more embedded in politics as it's practiced. I think most obviously the question that is so often raised in this context is the German Greens, who, as we've mentioned several times, co-founded by Petra Kelly, one of the earliest Greens parties in the world, twice found themselves, including now, in federal government in coalition during a land war in Europe, and have found themselves supporting military action, once in the case of responsibility to protect in the former Yugoslavia, once now in the case of coming to the defense of Ukraine. And Greens, of course, around the world have struggled with how we actually manage these kinds of questions in the complexity of governance. It's so crucial that we imagine the world beyond borders, the world which is different from as it is. I'd love your reflections on how we manage this balance of being the party that imagines the different world while still operating in the world as it is. How do you think we've gone, and how's that balance gone? I might go to you first, Bob, and then to Joe.
Well, it's a good point you bring up, because it's an incredibly difficult world, but you have to be strong at the same time as non-violent. And there's a commitment never to create aggression against another country, against another people. But the ability to be able to ward off.
Sorry, I'm very sorry, Bob. Somehow your video has stopped. Would you mind restarting? I apologize for that. If you go onto your display, hopefully either you or Paul can restart that video. I'm not quite sure how that happened. There we are. Wonderful. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you. See how easily things can go wrong.
Right.
What a precipice we're on when it comes to the massive weapons, those thousands of nuclear weapons and so on that we have around the world at the moment. We have to both be strong, but at the same time, absolutely committed to not being aggressive, but to finding peace. And it's a pipe dream in the current circumstances. But what had Germany been in the position of being able to intervene much earlier, to have Russia included in the European orbit instead of excluded? What if there'd been people on the Russian side, like that gallant commander of the submarine in the Cuban Missile Crisis that Joe was talking about? And I remember I was first-year university student. It was terrifying. Russia was sending, the USSR was sending nuclear rockets, nuclear weapons on rockets to implant in Cuba, right next to the United States. And Kennedy said, do that, and we'll go to war with you. Out in the ocean, the Russian fleet was turned back, but unbeknownst to the submarines underneath, there was a huge American armada went out. They lost contact with Moscow, and depth charges were being dropped by the American fleet. And faced with this situation, the commander of the submarine, the Russian submarine, had to decide whether or not to send a nuclear-tipped torpedo into the American fleet. And he decided he would, but he needed the vote of the 3 senior people aboard unanimously. His co-chief decided he would, but aboard was a more senior officer still who'd been involved in a nuclear submarine disaster just a couple of years before, and he refused to agree. He said, "We don't know. We've lost contact. We don't know that we're at war. I cannot commit to that." And it's now felt by many who have now been acquainted with what happened in that submarine that prevented a nuclear war back in 1962. And that would have been, we wouldn't be here now because of the consequent nuclear winter. And that man was reviled when he went back to Russia, and his crew were shamed. But he quietly, his wife stood by him all the way. He quietly maintained the dignity of having prevented the firing of those nuclear weapons. We can't continue to allow ourselves to be in this situation. And Tim, when it comes to the Greens in Germany, I don't want to speak for them. What I do want to say is that we in Australia should learn to be in this situation of becoming a nation which is offering to enter into disputation, whether it's Myanmar or the Spratly Islands or in some of those remarkably destructive wars going on in Africa at the moment. We should be able to be putting in instead of spending our billions of dollars, $300 billion on future nuclear submarines, establishing ourselves as a peace centre, a non-violence centre, moving in to offer an alternative to the destruction that's going on in those wars. Anywhere around the world, we should be doing that. And we'd be proud of ourselves instead of feeling slightly vulnerable to some future nuclear attack because we're getting nuclear submarines.
Thank you so much, Bob. Joe, your reflections on that question?
Yes, well, I remember when Joschka Fischer was the foreign minister in Germany and that terrible war was going on in Germany, and he was in a very, very difficult position. It split the Greens because there were people who said we should never allow bombing to happen, in our name. And yet there were people who were being slaughtered. I mean, it's a bit like what's happening now in Palestine, in Gaza. So, I mean, Bob's absolutely right. What we have to do is to create the culture of peace. And Greens in Australia should be doing that at the highest level and all the time, making submissions. The people who are elected representatives, and we've got a fabulous bunch of people representing us in Canberra at the moment, I'm really pleased to say. But we need those people to perhaps step outside their particular portfolios at times and together to say, we want to promote peace. Instead of wasting money on expensive weapon systems. I mean, the whole AUKUS thing is just an absolute nightmare and a schmozzle, and I don't think those nuclear submarines will ever get here, but we have to campaign against them because we can't just let the powers that be think that the Australian population supports them. This is what's so important. We have to speak up all the time for the things that we believe in. So we should be promoting diplomacy all the time, peacemaking, speaking to the so-called enemies. Not that Australia should have any enemies. How fortunate we are. We're an island nation with no natural enemies at all, but we take on the Americans' enemies far too readily. They drag us into wars, which they never win. I mean, not that I really want them to win anything, but they drag us into wars which end in absolute nightmare situations for the environment and for the people wherever they go. There are so few years since they got independence. I think it's 16, 18, maybe 20 years only in all that time that the United States has not been at war, hot war, or interfering in other nations' affairs and overthrowing governments that they don't particularly like, that don't suit their purposes. How foolish we are to let ourselves be used over and over again by the Americans. I mean, it makes my blood boil, actually, but I'll be non-violent about that. We mustn't go into violence as we resist, but we must resist. We've got to be persistent. We've got to be clear. We've got to plan our actions and absolutely represent peacemaking as the most important aspect, I would say, of our 4 pillars, because as Bob has said so clearly, without that framework, without that important 4th pillar, we don't have anything. Everything is connected to everything else, as we all know. But the fundamental has to be that we've got to learn to get on with people at the personal level, at the national level, at the international level, with people whose backgrounds are different, whose belief systems are different. And we need to be concentrating on diplomacy and trade and exchanges so that we get to know people in other countries, so that we don't feel fearful of people just because they're different. I mean, the Indigenous people, as Tim said in the very beginning, have a lot to teach us. They might have had their skirmishes, mostly about people running off with the people from wrong skin groups. That was their main area of contention from one group to another, but not about property, not about boundaries. I would love to see a world where we didn't have national flags, where we actually got to consider ourselves as global citizens, planetary citizens. And I've heard Bob use that phrase before. That's what we've got to continue in our minds, to think big picture thoughts about how we can survive, how we can leave the world for our children and our grandchildren less bad than it is at the moment. That's what one of my friends said to me recently. We've already passed a tipping point with the climate crisis of 1.5 degrees warm. We've already passed that, as Christine Milne told us years ago we would. So I think that phrase is quite useful, to make the world less bad for our children and grandchildren and their grandchildren, by standing up for what we believe in, by absolutely not giving in to the military industrial complex. Now, which president reminded us about that when he left office? Eisenhower. Beware the military industrial complex. And we haven't paid enough attention to it. It has ridden roughshod over the global community ever since the early 60s. And that is to the discredit of all of us. So even if we can't get exactly the peaceful climate that we would like to see in the world, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be working for it with every fiber of our being, every breath that we take. Everything is political. Everything matters. Every single thing matters.
Thank you so much, Joe. And of course, yes, the military-industrial complex weaves capitalism and imperialism and violence all together so closely. And you pointing out Bob's talk about planetary citizens. I have such clear memories of Bob in your life. I think it was in relatively close to your retirement. You made a speech about Earthlings and planetary democracy, and the press gallery absolutely went nuts. Their minds exploded. They could not conceive of what you were talking about. And I guess I want to.
Well, I was just putting forward a point of view about us being Earth citizens that goes right back to Socrates, no doubt before that. And every time anybody brings it up, there's this horror that we should think that everybody on this planet's equal with us, and we should be sharing with them. And we should have a global democracy based on one person, one vote, one value, one planet. But it's essential. There is no other way that we as a human species currently marauding this planet will be able to back off and live with the planet instead of off it, without we have a compact with ourselves. And yes, the Murdoch media went into conniptions over that. But there's an exemplar of what's wrong with the power structures on the planet we have at the moment.
100%. It does, though, go to the question of the power of our imaginations, which I genuinely believe, and I know you both do too, that people's imaginations are much greater than leaders pretend and like to believe they are. Nevertheless, it does feel, as I said at the beginning, and there's been a couple of comments, including Graham's comment in the chat, that the commitment to nonviolence, the understanding of its power that both of you articulated so well, has waned somewhat, partly due to the fact that there's less NVDA going on and less NVDA trainings, nonviolent direct action trainings. And Graham's question relates specifically to people getting involved in campaigns like Save Wallam, who haven't necessarily done training and don't necessarily understand the power of nonviolence. Obviously, training is part of it, conversations is part of it, which is why the Green Institute started this. I'd be interested in thoughts of both of you on kind of how we bring it back into the imaginations of people that nonviolence does have the power to create changes. In fact, the most powerful tool.
Well, the powers of nonviolence are inexhaustible. I mean, we can do anything if we are committed to nonviolence, and training is really important. Getting people to actually undergo training is a bit difficult, I know. We used to have whole weekends devoted to nonviolence training back in the 70s, and it was fantastic. One of the things that's very important about nonviolence training is that it's got to be fun. We've got to have fun resisting the authorities. And there are so many good stories about people doing creative things and fun things that are colourful and attract attention, but remain within the realms of nonviolence. So we need to use our imaginations and think big picture, big actions, the training is terribly important, because if we don't do that, it's all too easy for the government, as it is doing around the country, to introduce more and more draconian laws to intimidate people from taking nonviolent direct action. People are being pilloried and referred to as terrorists, when really we're trying to save the planet, and the planet wreckers get the protection of the police and of the governments, the police doing the government's work. I've always been a believer in respecting everybody when you're involved in an action, and that includes the police. There was one occasion when I remember, back in the days of 54B, when we were complaining about the fact that the Liberal government here wanted to ban gatherings of more than 3 people in public places. I mean, it was absolutely and utterly stupid. And so we had this gathering outside the GPO, and it began to get a little bit nasty. People were calling out horrible things about the police. And I, very young person at that stage, well before Senate days, but with Quaker nonviolent training behind me, I got up and I said, look, our argument is not with the police. Our argument is with the legislators. Our argument is with the government. Let's be respectful. Would everybody please sit down? Well, they did. Hundreds of people in the square sat down. And what was so embarrassing about that was that the policeman who was in charge, whoever he was, got up and said, now this young woman is speaking some sense. What's your name, dearie? And so I said my name, and he said, well, thank you, Joe Vallentine. Well, I was embarrassed. I was mortified to be being thanked by the police in charge of the demonstration, but it did the trick. People sat down, people got arrested, they were carted away, but respectfully. It is so important to show respect all round and to realize where our argument actually is. And if people haven't been in touch with the Australian Democracy Network, I would suggest that that is a very fertile ground to go to, because they've put out this fabulous paper, a year or two back now, called State Capture. And they have two particular examples. One is the military and the weapon systems, because they make money out of wars. They enjoy fueling conflict so they can make money, and they don't care who they sell the weapons to. That's one. And the other is the fossil fuel industries. Those two case studies, it's probably stuff that most people on this webinar would know about, but seeing it all laid out, chapter and verse, it's so clear. They've kind of got us over a barrel, but we've got to roll that barrel and take it out from underneath them. We mustn't give in to those two particular odious influences in our democracy. So our democracy relies on people speaking out, not letting our politicians think that they can get away with this or that or the other because no one's speaking up. I'm a great believer in the power of the handwritten letter, actually. I mean, when I was in the Senate, and probably the same for Bob too, if you got a handwritten letter, you should reply to it. It's only polite. You should reply to letters as an elected representative. Well, they don't bother anymore. Not if you just send them an email, but I write a handwritten letter and I stick it in a red or purple envelope thinking, well, somebody will have a look at that, surely. And sometimes I actually get a reply. But if hundreds and thousands of us kept letting our politicians know in every way we possibly can that we don't approve of what they're doing, then they might have second thoughts. And what's really interesting coming up is that I think the government is going to have to accept a minority government. They're going to have to go in coalition with somebody. They hate the Greens' guts, unfortunately, because we are like a conscience to them. And once a federal minister said that to my mother when I was introducing her to people in Canberra, and he said, oh, Joe's like a conscience to the Labor Party. And I thought, oh, really? Well, that's good. But, you know, we've got to keep saying what we want and what we disapprove of, politely, non-violently, respectfully.
If I can, Tim, just very quickly too, following on Joe, when I left the Senate, I wanted to become an environmental activist again because action is required. So our foundation has established, and people can ask for this and get it, handbooks on non-violence. Everybody who goes into the forest or the Tarkine or wherever we might be in our campaigns against industrial aquaculture and so on has to be trained in non-violence. It's very, very important because it's really anger management. And if people haven't thought about it, they get carried away by it down the line. And as Joe said, it isn't the police they can be a trouble. They can also be very good, but they're not making the decisions. The corporate sector, the exploiters of nature are. Anyway, we have had more than 100 people arrested defending the Tarkine forests. But here's the outcome of non-violent action there. There's 3,000 hectares, which in 2019, mainly rainforest, with their wildlife, were targeted to be destroyed by now because we got in their way peacefully, but determinedly, and with everybody trained. They've managed to log 58 hectares, not 3,000. That's where non-violence makes a difference.
That's
right.
yeah.
And you and I, Bob, were both involved in Jabiluka at different times. How long has that taken? So that's the other aspect of it. Don't give up, people. If you're in a campaign and you don't get results straight away, you've got to keep at it and keep at it. That's taken, 25 years or something. And finally, we've got the result that we wanted. Thank goodness for the Mirarr people. They stood strong and white fellas stood beside them. And we all had to be trained in non-violence to get to that campaign and to be part of that. They actually had passports and we had to make certain agreements before we were allowed to be there. That was impressive.
Tremendously important. Thank you so much. And your comments, both of you, about the police, I think are very relevant in terms of non-violence theory of how it actually creates change. That we read from Erica Chenoweth and Hannah Arendt and so many others talking about how non-violence works by convincing those who are tasked with actually delivering on the policies of government to change sides and to stop protecting those in power and start doing the right thing. And relevantly, there's a question which I wanted to put to both of you from Kate here in the chat. What do the panel think about ASIO lifting the terror threat to probable? And in the same news bulletin, Albo including paint being thrown on windows of PM's offices by pro-Palestine protesters as an example. Throwing paint and graffiti are considered non-violent, yes, civil disobedient and by nature illegal, but not terrorism. And of course, this goes to something that both of you have talked a lot about in terms of the way governments and police have been lifting the increasingly criminalizing protest, lifting penalties, jailing people much more than has ever been done before in Australia, and labeling non-violent protest violent, which is a very difficult thing to confront. I'd be interested in both of your thoughts on kind of how we manage that.
Well, I think the first thing is to understand the power of words. And we get called forest activists or worse things than that, extremist radicals and so on by the government. But our term for it is forest defenders. And we're determined about that. And some of the media is now starting to use that terminology. It's very important to think very carefully about what the message is in the words, in the wordage. And of course, they know by saying that people are who are acting peacefully are violent, that might have an impact. But the public's got more sense than many politicians give it allow for, and they understand when they're being taken for a ride, and they are in those circumstances. There's been no violence in the history of our foundation. There's been nobody hurt, no violence occurred at all, and they've tried very often to say that we are violent. In fact, we had Senator Duniam, Liberal, Tasmania, on Sky News talking about tree spiking and a whole range of other things, and he was forced to retract it under threat of legal action. And you hate to go to that, but they have to be checked on the use of that sort of abusive and false language when it arises. But ultimately, it's sticks and stones. It's what's very important is defending the principle you're standing for. And I might say, when it comes to Albo saying that people shouldn't be demonstrating, and he knows where the line is outside offices, that's just the cowardice of politics, you know. The same Prime Minister will not come and look at the burnt ruins of Australian forests where he could intervene and protect them. This is the same Prime Minister who won't come and look at the depredations on the environment, and certainly at some of the worst social injustices that are going on in Australia. So, you know, come on, Albo. If you think that somebody behaving badly should be your target outside political offices, how about you do something to stop the bad behaviour towards Indigenous people in Australia, or towards our wonderful ocean ecosystems or the coral reef? How about you stop opening more coal mines and more gas polluting, you know, the whole thing? It's absurd. And of course, when Prime Ministers make statements like that, we need to take them on.
Absolutely. To go back to language, I think it's terribly important. I always cringe when I hear people talking about fighting for peace. We can struggle for peace. We can work for peace. We mustn't use the word fight. We don't want to be in a fight. We want to be in an educative process where people listen. And the government clearly is not listening, but I think at their peril. I think they're going to, you know, really come up against the community opposition. There are many campaigns around the country now for independence, more independents to run. I wish they'd all actually support the Greens, but somehow or other people think the Greens are too radical. That's a big shame. But we can support the independents if they break that stranglehold of the two major parties. But we have to call them out whenever they use terrible language about us, or about people who are protesting non-violently. We've got Woodside here in the West wanting to really ruin the oldest rock art gallery in the world and create enormous amount of emissions. And the people in the Disrupt Burrup Hub, which is the frontline activist crew, they're very brave. And that's what we've got to be, very brave. We've got to be bold and brave and challenge in every way we possibly can these companies which are actually ruining our country and the world, because it's not just us. As we know, this gas gets exported. A lot of it gets exported to Japan. And would you believe they on-sell it at a profit to them? So we're not, I mean, even on an economic level, it is insane, absolutely insane. So the language we use, the way we operate, that it's all very, very important in the big struggle that we have for the survival, and not just the survival, but, the thriving of our planet. I'd love to see that more spoken about. And thanks, Bob, for your beautiful words. When you do inspire people and make the press gallery sit up, and, it's just big picture thinking that they're not used to. And we've got to continue to try and be heard in that space. Like, we've got to listen to others. We want them to listen to us.
We absolutely must. Thank you. One final question, if I may. We usually try to close exactly at 1:15. So one final question before we wrap. An important one from Jody, I think it is in the chat, asking about the Defence Pathways program in school, pushed through STEM and trades. And I would extend that as well into the way the defence industries have inserted themselves into the tertiary education sector. Here in Canberra, we're facing an extraordinary issue with the ANU deciding that it's going to get behind AUKUS and build a nuclear industry in Australia. Do either of you have thoughts on how we take on the way, similar to how it controls language, the military-industrial complex is worming its way into the education sector in a very destructive manner?
Well, I think that parents and educators need to speak out about this. There is a good national organisation, Teachers for Peace. They're very concerned about this, and we need to support them. And it's so offensive that kids in primary school are being offered a competition to design a nuclear reactor for a submarine. I mean, it is absolutely appalling stuff, because it legitimizes the whole notion of militarism in these kids' minds. I mean, what are we allowing to happen in our schools and our universities? It's just appalling.
Yes, that's true, Joe. And nevertheless, we're dealing with a situation in which the majority of people will do nothing. We are the parents saying that we're not going to allow that in our schools. We'll withdraw our kids if you proceed with that, because it's just brainwashing, and it's deliberated, and it's come out of think tanks of psychologists working on it, as much of the advertising in our world does. But we mustn't also get too distressed by the fact that we can't do everything. We have to take on those things we can and carry through with them, and know about, but put on the shelf the things we can't deal with. Otherwise, we end up all feeling hopeless. So it's very important to, there's the job of the media, and it's very important for the parents groups to know what's going on and to take action about it, real action, not just writing letters, but taking action. This is so incredibly important that disrupts the ability of that sort of insidious impregnation into the young minds of the nation that they should be winning money for working out how to make nuclear reactors for nuclear submarines and everything that flows from that. However, I'm with Emma Goldman. I don't want your revolution if I can't dance. We've got to have fun as we go along, and we've got to confine to our actions to what we can achieve. The most decorated soldier of the Vietnam War, Colonel Hackworth, grabbed me by the collar in the time when Reagan was up for his second election. Joe, he was in Hobart. We had a meeting on Forest, and he said, "You've got to stop this. You've got to work against Reagan because he's about to press the button and he'll destroy the world." And it just struck me then, if that's the case, David, I said to him, I'm going home to read a book. We just cannot get ourselves over anxious about all this. We need clear thinking. We need to look after ourselves, those around us, and have some fun. You know, it's that is essential to being powerful when it really matters.
Absolutely. I'd just like to mention one more thing about absolutely stopping the police in their tracks when you start doing the Elm Dance. This was taught to us by Joanna Macy, an amazing non-violent theologian, Buddhist theologian from the United States. And when she went to the affected area after the Chernobyl disaster, she taught this Latvian dance, and people there were so moved by it. They said, please teach this dance wherever you do a workshop. So she did. She still does. And it's very simple. In a circle, doing this elm dance. I've done it in so many places. At the gates of NATO, for example, in Brussels, when we were, trying to do a citizens' inspection about nuclear weapons. And in many places, in the forest, it completely stops the authorities in their tracks because they sense that there's something happening in this dance, which is not just, there are no words spoken. We hum it maybe, or have the music, and we do this circle dance. And it's quite a spiritual moment, and they don't know what to do about it. It confounds them. And so it gives the protesters more time to figure out their next move, or to prepare for the arrests, which it often follow, and so on. But it does give pause for thought. So we've got to do things like that, which are unexpected. And, it sort of puts a spanner in their thinking works, and that's all useful.
Absolutely wonderful. I can't imagine a better way to end this conversation than by talking about I don't want to be part of your revolution if I can't dance. And those wonderful ideas. I have coincidentally just started listening to a podcast series that I want to recommend to everyone with Joanna Macy, who is still talking well into her late 90s, I believe, called We Are the Great Turning. Do check that out. It's very deep interviews with Joanna about her work, which is just tremendously inspiring. Thank you so much, Joe and Bob, for giving us your time this evening for this wonderfully deep and inspiring conversation. I've popped into the chat there, which I'm sure you'll all have seen in various places, a link to the Missing Peace webpage. We now have the next 2 webinars already able to be looked at and booked in for as well. In a month, we have the wonderful Dr. Flick Gray and Vesna Chironi and Sunday Stephen come to talk to us about the power of nonviolence. Flick is known to many of us in the Green Institute as works now out of Washington for Nonviolent Peace Force and has a PhD in the power of nonviolence. Sunday is one of her colleagues on the front lines in South Sudan, working with Nonviolent Peace Force. And Vesna, now with the Bob Brown Foundation, was one of the student youth movement who nonviolently overthrew Slobodan Milosevic. So we have an extraordinary webinar for you in about a month. And the following month, we have the wonderful, brilliant Greens women, Giz Watson and Janet Rice, to talk to us about consensus decision-making, working better across difference and nonviolence, and how these relate. And then soon after that, we'll have one on First Nations decolonizing and nonviolence as well, which will be up very soon. I'm so pleased we've had a bigger response to this webinar than pretty much any we've ever done, which is very exciting. Thank you all for coming along to be part of this conversation, and just huge thanks, Bob and Joe, not just for your time this evening, but for everything you have brought to our movement, our party, and our world. It's a tremendous privilege to have you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Blessings.